guys, welcome back to Keith's Garage. Special thank you again to all my subscribers and regulars who come back often and check in. Little bit of an update. I was down at the machine shop yesterday checking out my block for my 38 Plymouth, and it's looking mighty fine. There's something special about a nice clean block that's been hot tanked and fresh deck machining work on it. Looks good. I'll see if I can share a photo here. I'll try and edit one into the video and you can have a look at what I saw yesterday. Pretty exciting stuff. I should have my block back into next week, and then I get back to reassembling. Finally. It'll be May 1st before I start putting that engine back together. Hard to believe when I took that out in November of last fall. Today's video, I'm going to talk maybe we do something a little bit on something neat. We'll show you some carburation stuff. You know, I remember when I was in high school in the 80s, late 80s. I graduated in 89. That'll give you an idea how old I am. I took shop class in high school and I screwed around and I vacuumed cars almost every class, you know, it's just goofing off. I did learn a few things. Probably didn't retain as much as I should have, but what do you know? You're a teenager, right? You have no idea that when you're 50 years old, you might be needing that information on an old car like this, my 53 Chrysler. Back when I was in high school, most cars were still all carbureted. Mind you, I was into jalopies, that's all I could afford, right? Kind of like Archie and Jughead driving around the old jalopy. In my era, same thing. It wasn't a Model A Ford convertible. It would have been a 74 Pinto or a 76 Slant 6 Dart, maybe Dodge Dart Slant 6. Carbureted. Old junk in the 80s that nobody wanted anymore. And by that time, all the new cars were coming out with pretty much switching over to fuel injection. I think it started out mostly mainstream cars that I was around. I wasn't really close to high-end sports cars or anything at that time. I saw throttle body injection, which is a single injector at the intake of the, sort of like the carburetor intake. It's not a carburetor though, it'd be the throttle body injection. And then we got the multi-port fuel injection. And where I'm going with this is a lot of young people today that really haven't been around carburetors at all. You know, they were born long after carburetors pretty much became extinct. You can still find them on pressure washers and lawn mowers and weed whackers, you know, lawn and garden stuff, I guess. But they're pretty disposable. You get a chainsaw or a weed whacker and the carburetor acts up, you probably throw it out and get another one. You're not making all the adjustments like you would on an old car. So a lot of young kids coming into the hobby today, getting into the old cars, maybe this video is for you. Just give you some tips to help you out on some simple ways to troubleshoot quickly. If you broke down on the side of the road, take your air cleaner off, have a look in the carburetor. I'm going to show you what to look for. So we'll do some simple stuff there. Maybe let's just have a look at the exhaust control valve there, that directional control valve that heats up the base of my carburetor. See if this one's working on here. We studied all about it in the last couple of videos about how that works. Let's see if it works on this car. You know, never really studied it on this particular car. So here we go, some simple tips. Help you out when you're broke down on the side of the road, because I know I've been there. And I've been stumped a couple times. But when you understand what it's supposed to do, how things work, why they work the way they do, you can troubleshoot quickly. Handful of tools, man, you can fix a lot of things on these cars on the side of the road if you understand how they work. So study, kids. Get some books, get some old books, get some books from the 40s, 50s, 60s. Read all about it. Understand what it does, and you can become a really efficient home mechanic looking after these old cars. So Mopars are cheap, easy to get into, fun to work on, reliable. I recommend. Here we go. Thank you. When your car doesn't want to start, or maybe you're driving it and it just dies on you, and you got one of these old cars, and where do you start, right? Especially if you're new at it. You got a new old Mopar like mine, and you know, there's so many things that it could be, right? And you ask a question on a public forum, and you get like 1,000 different answers because everybody wants to help, and that's cool. But it can really lead you down a wild goose chase if you don't know really where to start, and you're trying everything, and someone says, do this, change that, open this, change that, change. So I'll give you an example. You're cranking your car over. No, that's a 12 volt. So it'll be like, wah, 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 wah. That's a 6 volt starter. And It's not starting. Or you drove it and it hiccuped a couple times and it died. If you understand carburetors, you'll understand what an accelerator pump is. And it's a little plunger that goes into the fuel bowl, and when you cycle the throttle like this, it actually pushes the plunger, it pushes raw fuel out and into the carburetor, into the throttle body area here, in the venturi. So if you're wondering if you're getting fuel, or maybe you're out of fuel, right? Maybe. Fuel, spark, compression, 3 things you need, basically, to get the engine running. Quick check for fuel. So, you break down. Choke's probably going to be open if you just broke down and the engine's hot. It's probably going to be sitting like that. Cold engine, it closes. Get a flashlight if you can. Look down the throat of your carburetor here with the choke held open, and just look in there and hit the throttle once, and you should see a squirt of raw fuel being shot into the carburetor. Okay, so looking down on the carburetor here. Choke valve now stays open. You look down there, when I give it a shot of, you're going to see raw fuel. See that shot of fuel there? Maybe you'll see it better over here on this side. See that? That's telling me that, it's telling me a couple things. One is we know that we've got a good fuel supply. So if you broke down the side of the road, pull your air filter off, cycle the throttle, and look in there. That is your accelerator pump. There's a dead spot when you floor the throttle on your vehicle and it starts to rev up. It's demanding, there's more air. There's more air coming in. You've opened up the throttle valve. It needs more fuel. And to prevent any delays or a quick acceleration, they shoot in some raw fuel with the accelerator pump. So that's a quick check to make sure you got fuel in your bowl and it's getting into your engine. So that tells me that we've got a good working fuel pump, we got a good fuel supply, and the bowl's full, and we get a nice good shot of raw fuel. So that's just a quick tip if you're on the side of the road troubleshooting. This little valve right here, this little tube in the top, that does not really apply any fuel or air to the carburetor. What it does is it's keeping, it's a vent for the bowl. The carburetor bowl's down here that holds the fuel. And this is a vent to atmospheric pressure. So it's always maintaining atmospheric pressure on the top of the fuel. Now when the air goes down in the carburetor and it's being sucked in by the pistons, vacuum in the intake stroke, the air pressure drops and it's below atmospheric pressure down inside the carburetor down there. And that actually, because we've got atmospheric pressure on top of the fuel and we've got a low pressure vacuum on the bottom side down here, the carburetor, it actually helps suck. And you got an air sucking fuel, but you got atmospheric pressure pushing the fuel out the carburetor jets and down into the intake manifold. This particular carburetor is set up for my transmission, which is the semi-automatic. It's basically a high-low range tranny, M6. Tip-toe shift was also known as. It's got a couple electric wires here. We'll get to those in a second. I'll tell you what they do. So when I hit the throttle here, this choke's going to fully tighten up. It's fully closed. So when the choke is on and the car fires up, it's trying to suck in the proper air-fuel mixture, but it can't. The air supply is being choked off. That's why it's called a choke. It's like choking somebody around the neck, right? You can't breathe. So it limits the amount of air that can go into the carburetor. So by nature, we're going to get more fuel. So it's going to run rich, which what we want. We want a rich air-fuel mixture on a cold engine. We talked about a lot of the fuel coming down inside the intake manifold, and it doesn't necessarily stay vaporized very well. The fuel droplets stick to the sides of the walls of the cold intake manifold, and we don't get an even flow of nice air fuel to each cylinder. So we're going to run a rich air fuel mixture until it heats up. And our thermal bypass valve there, exhaust bypass valve down this area, blows the hot air up into the base of the intake manifold here to heat everything up as soon as possible. And it's no coincidence that the intake manifold is right beside the exhaust manifold, so it heats up, everything gets nice and hot, and keeps the carburetor air fuel mixture all nice, cozy, and warm. Okay, so my car is cold right now. It's not been run in at least 24 hours. Everything's cold. You can see the spring is working as it should. It's keeping the manifold diverter, heat diverter valve in the direction that makes the hot gases flow up. It comes in this way, hits the valve, and goes up, come back out the other side. As this heats up, it's going to get loose. It's going to go that way, of course, we know that. We're going to try that. We're going to see if it's going to work. Right now, it returns every time I push it. One other thing I noted is that when you give the car a good shot of acceleration, the movement of the exhaust gases will allow this to actually open right away, even when it's cold. And that's so it doesn't restrict exhaust flow. If you rev it up, this is going to move. But at idle, this will loosen up. So let's fire it up and see what happens. Get her warmed up. Choke's closed. I'm going to fire it up. I always give it one pump of gas first. A little raw fuel in there. Usually when the engine is cold, you're going to get a little rough idling. It's normal. I'm sure you've all experienced that. That's the uneven fuel delivery to each cylinder until everything heats up. We'll let everything get warmed up. See, she's getting pretty warm now. Not quite. My choke is wide open now. You can see it. The spring is heated up. Nice warm air flowing through into here to heat the spring up. So it opens every time. But my exhaust diverter valve is not staying forward yet. It's not quite hot enough. It's been running for about 5 minutes. Okay, hopefully I'm not beating a dead horse here. If you look now, you can see my valve is all the way forward and staying there because the spring has shrunken up and it's loose, and the counterweight is what allows it to stay forward now because the spring tension is released. The counterweight makes it lean to the front. That means the valve inside there is closed off right here, and exhaust gases are not going up to the base of the carburetor. Now as the car cools down, of course that's going to shrink. It's going to sit in this position. When it's in that position, it is redirecting gases up. It's not moving at all. It's not bouncing around right now because it's fully closed, which is what it's supposed to do. It's working well. Now you're probably not going to notice much of a difference if it's working or not, other than it may take a little longer for your carburetor to heat up and get a nice smooth running engine. This allows it just to heat up quicker. Alrighty. This little tool here, and we talked about it using it for vacuum in an earlier video. It's also, the gauge goes this way for vacuum, and it goes that way for pressure. So you can actually tee it in to your fuel line here and test your fuel pump pressure. It should be up in that 3.5 or so PSI for traditional mechanical fuel pump that was on these engines. Great tool. Again, doubles as a fuel pump pressure gauge as well. Recommend you get one of those. So happens that I have a spare carburetor in my junk pile. This is a very similar carburetor to what's on my car, but it does not have an automatic choke. Well, it might have. It could have had a sys-on choke, I think it's called. With the see how I can manually open and close it? There is no thermal metallic spring here to heat up. I just want to show you that when we cycle the throttle, a couple things happen. Normally the throttle would be in that position. That's closed. And when I say the throttle, we're looking up inside here at this valve. See how I open and close it? That's when we open it, we're letting more air into the engine and more fuel. So normally it's in that position. So when we cycle the throttle, a couple things happen over here. There's linkage down here that moves. This area here. That's cycling your acceleration pump, your accelerator pump. This is it right here. I wanted to show you that when you're opening the throttle, this goes down and it's pumping gas. This is the bowl area here out into your carburetor whenever you cycle the throttle. If you don't have a good shot of fuel coming out of there, look at your obviously fuel supply. Make sure you got good fuel, but also this little accelerator pump here. This is supposed to be a leather cup on the bottom here. and it's all hard and brittle because it's old, and it pushes down like this and it forces fuel, just like I showed you in my carburetor out inside. The other thing that could happen is this spring is pretty weak and old and tired. A friend of mine, I'm gonna call him out here, Mr. Hill, he had a problem when I went and seen him. He's got a 37 Plymouth, and I went to visit him, and he had a stalling problem. When he would rev up his engine, open the throttle, it would sputter and it wouldn't clean up, and if you went slowly, it would slowly clean up and then it would rev up. And I got looking in his carburetor and I could see that we weren't getting much of a shot of raw fuel at all. So I suspected the accelerator pump here was a problem, and what happened was his spring was pretty much collapsed and wasn't really giving him a full stroke. So I took it apart, stretched the spring, and put it back together, and that fixed the problem. So just a little tip for you on accelerator pumps, what they do. This particular carburetor has another pump on it as well. It has to do with the over here on this side. There's another, I'll show you another one here. Another leather cup. This one, as you open the throttle, it actually comes up and lifts up. And when you let the throttle go, it slowly goes down. And what it's doing is it's preventing the carburetor from stalling. There's a solenoid here on this particular model of car. I think the fluid drive or the fluid torque drive has it. This is an electric solenoid. It sits on the top of the carburetor right there. And there's 2 wires going to it. And when it gets 6 volts, energizes the solenoid in there, and there's a little valve that's missing. It goes down into a jet there. It opens up that valve and allows fuel to flow into the carburetor, prevent it from stalling when you take your foot off the gas when you're downshifting. So that's 2 wires there for the solenoid, and that's 6 volts. I put 6 volts on it and it became magnetic instantly. It just happens to be missing the part in this carburetor. And there's another electrical hookup right here. Plugs in there a wire. If you look at the carburetor, my car has it. There's a pin here. And when the throttle is open, when you floor the throttle, that closes that pin. You see that happening? Now, under very specific circumstances, there's a whole bunch of things that's got to line up and work. There's sensors in the transmission. There's spinning contact points in the transmission that when they hit a certain speed, there's vacuum going on in the carburetor at different speeds. Let's just say you're cruising along in 4th gear and you're under 30 miles an hour or so. There's a switch in the transmission that spins. I've talked about it in other videos. When you're at 30 miles an hour, the points are contacts are in a position where when I close this, a couple things happen. It forces a downshift. This allows the transmission to make a shift. There's some other things going on as well, but if you floor your throttle when you're in 4th gear, under 30 miles an hour, you should force a downshift. It should go down into 3rd, which is called passing gear as well. And that's what's initiating that happening when you floor the throttle. You're pushing that in a wire from the contacts in the carburetor that are spinning. A couple things happen. It makes a downshift. It also kills power to the coil and the distributor coil very briefly, so there's no power on the transmission input pinion coming off the engine. Kills all power to the engine, and that allows the torque to come off the pinion. Then it can easily slide and a gear in the tranny and shift. So that's what your electrical connections are here. Maybe one other thing we'll point out, I don't know if we can see it clearly or not, this old carburetor here, pretty dirty. But if our throttle valve is closed, when you're setting idle speed, you're setting this screw right here. You're actually just forcing the linkage to be partially open. There's a setting on the carburetor here, a screw, you'll set it, or maybe it's this one down here, I'm not sure. You adjust it, and you're setting idle speed. So you're physically just forcing the throttle valve open slightly. But then there's this screw. We know that this is the air-fuel mixture screw. We talked about it in another video. We used a vacuum gauge to set the air-fuel mixture. Now what's different about the air-fuel mixture screw is it's an idle air mixture screw. You're adjusting a port that allows fuel to go into a little hole in the side of the carburetor that is just below or near this throttle valve. It's on the bottom side of the throttle valve somewhere. If I could, don't know if I could see it. Pretty dirty carburetor, but either when I close that valve, somewhere there's a hole near it, and raw fuel dribbles in below that. So when the engine's at idle, you're adjusting that fuel after the throttle valve. Otherwise, you're adjusting the valve, you're adjusting the fuel and vacuum, and atmospheric pressure is changing. I mentioned that as you open this throttle valve, and the fuel's coming in from a higher position. When all that's closed off, we still need control, so they have this idle air-fuel mixture screw. I think there's I see a hole right in there. Don't know if you can see it or not, but yeah, it's just right down there. I'm gonna get a flashlight. Okay, I'm hoping you can see it. Little tiny hole right in there. You see that little hole in there? Right there. The valve is closed. We're letting fuel in below the idle butterfly valve there. See the hole there? It's gonna be your air fuel adjustment screw at idle. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the float, which is this brass piece here. This happens to be a brass float. This is just a little retainer for the brass float. So this sits inside the fuel bowl, and as it fills with fuel, it floats up like this. Makes sense, right? Pretty easy. Just it floats. Comes up, sits like that. When it's out of fuel, goes down. If you look in this area, right here, there's a valve. As the float comes up, closes off the little needle valve here. See if I can get that better light there. And the float's moving there. Comes up and pushes. There we go, fully closed. Open, closed. So fuel comes up to the carburetor right here, and inside of there's a little valve. Let's take it out and have a look at it. There's our float. A good float needs to be sealed and waterproof, or gas-proof, liquid-proof. If it fills up with fuel, there's a leak in it and it sinks, your carburetor is not going to run. It's going to flood. It's going to run, but it's going to be, maybe, I've never had that symptom, but it'll be flooding because too much fuel. Let's look at the valve in there. There's a little needle valve that sits in there. See it? It's got a little rubber tip on it. That's what seals inside of this fitting right here. So fuel comes into there from the fuel pump. If the float's down, it pulls away and it allows the fuel pressure, knocks this little valve off its seat, allows fuel to come in to the carb bowl. And then when the carb's full and it doesn't want to see any more fuel, of course the float comes up, and this little tang right here pushes against the valve and seals it off so no more fuel can come in. Now this is very sensitive. If you screw around with this is when you're setting your float level, you're actually measuring how high it sits when it's full of fuel. You're adjusting this little tang here, and that can affect how lean or rich your fuel is across every RPM level in the carburetor, in the engine, based on how high that float level is. So you want that fairly accurate. You don't want to be flooding your engine with too much fuel either, so look up the spec on how to set that. So we talked about accelerator pump, dash pot, and decelerator fuel pump. This is the float intake, air idle screw, choke. This one, interesting. It did lots of different little chokes over the years. This one, there's a little spring there. You can see it. Now, rubber valve opens when the choke's closed. I don't see it opening. So the vacuum's going to open that. That's interesting. My car does not have that. My 53. I'm thinking this is like a 49 or a 50 carburetor. It's Carter. Oh, ball and ball, it says. Ball and ball carburetor, manufactured for Chrysler, Detroit, Michigan, USA. Cool. While we're on the topic of the fuel pump issues, sorry, not issues, but fuel pressure, the carburetors, typical fuel pump that you might see in one of these old cars. This rides on the camshaft. As it spins, it's got its own lobe, and it just pumps that in and out, like moves it back and forth. And the pump moves. the point I wanted to make was, if you're troubleshooting and you don't have any fuel, for some reason you can't start, check your fuel, make sure it's pumping out pressure. You can just actually disconnect the hose, turn the engine over, and fuel should squirting out of there. If it's not squirting out of there, you got a problem somewhere. But aftermarket, there's lots of these on eBay or various sources, suppliers that are aftermarket. And this lever pivots on a fulcrum point. Right here, there's a pin. These are prone to walking out. This pin falls out, then this becomes dislodged, and it no longer cranks. It won't build fuel pressure. So the pin goes right through from this side, comes out the other side, and then at the factory they punched it and swaged it or something to spread it out to make it stay in place. When you buy one today, it may not stay in place. I suffered the exact problem with an aftermarket pump. I put it on my car, and I didn't know what happened. The car died, had no fuel, and I found the pin had walked out. It still happened to be in place, but it was partially out, and then this wasn't working. So what I ended up doing is I tried swaging it a couple times, punched it with a pin punch. It still walked out on me. I eventually sealed both sides up over a period of a couple days. I kept applying JB weld to the head of that pin here and on this side, and I put it in layers, built it up. It's not coming out. And that was 2 years ago. So we do not have a problem with that pump anymore on my car. So be aware of that. Keep an eye out. So there you have it, folks. Today's simplified version of some fuel tips, full system, friend or foe. Figure it out. It worked for a lot of years. It's simple, it's basic, it's efficient. Not like fuel injection, but you study it, learn it, you can figure it out. Not hard. One interesting point I wanted to make, a little tidbit on Chrysler trivia. All the Chrysler engines that I've ever worked on, from as farthest I've gone back is 38, they all have the hardened valve seat inserts. I did a little research on that. And an interesting story is, back in the 30s, early 30s, they had heavy-duty Dodge trucks that were towing chunks of cast steel from the foundry to the factory. I guess castings for blocks. And this truck was carrying lots of weight with a trailer, and it had a heavy-duty engine in it. But it was pretty much running wide open throttle 24 hours a day. They had a contractor, and his complaint was the exhaust valves kept punching out the seats for the exhaust seats in the block. So they wanted to get on that. So there was actually a company that made a product called Stellite, which is super hardened steel. And they bought some Stellite inserts. They cut the worn valve seat open, froze the Stellite valve insert, put it in there, and fixed the problem. So I always thought it was Stellite inserts that were in all our engines, but it's not the case. Once they found the Stellite insert worked, then the Chrysler engineers worked together to come up with their own heat-treated, somehow tempered steel, and they found a way to do it economically, because the Stellite inserts are quite expensive. So they found a way to do it in their own. They did it themselves at the factory, and they were able to affordably put there you go, I almost said it again, not Stellite, but their own brand of hardened seats in all the engines. And they first started showing up in mass production in 1933. So there you go, there's a little tip. Thanks for hanging out. If you like what you see, subscribe and hit the like button. I'd love you if you do that. And we'll see you again on the next one. Have a good one, folks.